For the last 3 years, I've been travelling the world to discover and tell the incredible story of how beer built and changed the world. From the dusty dunes of the Egyptian desert to the frozen wilderness of Arctic Svalbard, as well as more likely places like Munich's beer halls and St. Louis's beer cathedrals. I've come to believe that the creation of beer and wider fermentation is as important to human development as the discovery of fire. The list of achievements made in the pursuit of better beer is mind-bending. We invented refrigeration to keep lager cellars cool, adopted pasteurization to keep beer fresh, and laid railways to take it places quicker. Beer has inspired some other great discoveries, including germ theory of disease, and brewer's yeast is now used to create vaccines, insulin, and even biofuels. All along, breweries have sponsored sports and TV, funded political parties, and influenced cultures and cuisines. All these stories and many more are told in my new book, The Meaning of Beer, out on the 7th of November 2024. Buy your copy today, right after you watch the first of a two-parter about how two men looking into the curse of sour beer ended up changing the world. So this week, Bradley, we're going to be telling what is probably my favourite and arguably the most important story in my new book.
Probably the best story in the world.
Probably the best story in the world. Nice link, because we're going to couple probably the best story with probably not the best beer in the world. I did say we were going to be drinking Carlsberg, but you'll be glad to see that we're not going to be drinking the original, what I think is now 3.4%.
It's the same colour as my van, it's not green.
So this is a super exciting beer, to be fair to Carlsberg, who do a lot of cool stuff sort of underground in the background, as we're about to understand. But this is a beer that is based on the original 1883 recipe of Carlsberg, and indeed is made using yeast from a bottle they found in the cellars from 1883. And that year is going to prove to be very significant in the history of Carlsberg, but also in the history of humanity, because this beer and the stories we're going to tell is not just the story of the isolation of yeast, which people might already clock we're going to be talking about, but it is also the story of the creation of modern brewing, the creation to some extent of modern medicine, and indeed a retelling of the story of creation itself.
Well, on that note, Johnny, should we crack a can of Carlsberg and get on with it?
So should we get the beer in the glass? And we'll talk about the beer a little bit further on. I've got 6 cans of these. In total, they cost about a tenner to get over from Denmark each. So
£10 a can.
we're going
Very expensive.
we're going to enjoy this. Yes, there's going to be no profit
Quite
from this
dark,
video.
isn't it?
It is a dark lager, and we'll get onto that reasoning in a bit. No, I think you've nailed that. That's the kind of head you want. I've if anything, undercooked it.
It's a Euro.
It's a Euro pour. So before we get to this beer and the incredible stories that come with it, we should rewind a little bit and talk about a time when we didn't really know what yeast really did. As we talked about in our religion episode, yeast was seen as a gift from God. We didn't really understand what it was. We just knew that it was producing this liquid that made us feel good, that rarely made us ill unless we drank too much of it. We didn't quite understand what the role of yeast was. We put it down to God. Now,
magic sticks.
Magic sticks. Yeah, magic sticks, magic pots, blessed pots, all this kind of stuff. Now, we started to understand that something more might be going on pretty early on. The word yeast comes from the word yeast, which means to bubble or foam, and that was in the original English dictionary. So we knew there was something that was going on in the bubbly sort of head that was appearing on our fermentations. And indeed, yeast was, I think, the second thing observed through a microscope as well, when that was invented in the 18th century, 1700s. So we knew that something was going on, but actually we didn't recognise that yeast was alive, all the people looking through the microscopes, and we didn't recognise it as the thing that was causing fermentation. We thought it was a byproduct of what was happening. So brewers at the time were transferring yeast from healthy fermentations to the next beer, and they knew this was getting them a reliable result. And obviously the secret behind that, the science behind that, it was important to work out what that was so we could get more efficient, reliable fermentations. And actually in France, an award was put out by the Academy of Science, I think, for like kilograms and kilograms of gold to anybody that could work out the secret of fermentation. And that was in the late 18th century, and it took nearly 100 years for it to be widely accepted what yeast was and what it was doing. And most people credit that discovery to Louis Pasteur.
Yes.
Which is kind of true, but really he's just the first scientist that the establishment believed. There were lots of other scientists coming up with these theories, examining yeast, and changing our views about what it was before Louis came along. And one of those was a guy called Theodor Schwann. And he was the first person that said, actually, I think yeast is alive. It's not like a chemical. But also he thought that it was the thing that was causing fermentation. And that put him ahead of some other people that had similar ideas. So he proved this by having 2 flasks with fermentable liquid inside. And one of these flasks, he essentially purified the air with extreme heating. The other one, he just left with the air that we breathe. And what he found was that the one that had the normal air that hadn't been cleaned, he found that it started fermenting. Whereas the one that he cleaned in this sealed jar didn't start fermenting. So this pointed out, obviously, that
something was alive.
There's something alive in the air.
It wasn't boiled to death.
Exactly.
Right.
So there was something in there that was fermenting. And this, seems like a fairly mundane kind of observation to some extent, and kind of obvious to us today. But back then, this fundamentally challenged our whole idea of where life came from, which was a theory called spontaneous generation. It was this idea that non-organic matter could produce organic matter. So that meant, that's where, I don't know, it's where mushrooms would grow out of mud and all this kind of stuff. Leeches would come out of flesh. It was a way of explaining very simple things that happen in nature, but it was also a way, to some extent, of explaining the origin of life itself, that we came from rocks or whatever it was, that there was some creation, some act of God that started that process.
So it's basically you couldn't see this microscopic stuff happening and life on that cellular level, so you had to sort of come up with some reason how it happened.
Yeah, where this stuff was coming from.
Spontaneous.
Yeah, and that theory was kind of put on notice by the invention of the microscope. Suddenly we saw that we weren't able to see all of life on Earth. And Schwann's experiment should have proved beyond doubt that that was the case. But he was kind of roundly dismissed by essentially old men that didn't want their worldviews changed, by the church that probably would have had some to say about it, like they had with, say, Charles Darwin, a very similar time in history. So then we get to the arrival of Louis Pasteur, who really takes this on further and creates some of the most important biological and scientific discoveries of the age. So Louis Pasteur, he's a chemist. He's not really involved in the brewing world, and the only reason that he gets involved is because at the time he was teaching at the University of Lille. And one of his students comes up to him and says, "My dad runs a beetroot distillery." Apparently beetroot vodka was once a thing. Maybe it still is, I don't know. Wow. And he said that they were getting sour fermentation. So the beetroot that they were fermenting and then distilling, they were getting sour fermentations, which was ruining the vodka. So Louis, I guess out of kinship to his student, says, "I'll come along and I'll have a look under my microscope and see if I can work out what's going on." And what he observes, and we know this from Mr. Bigot, this was the name of the student, from his diaries, is that when Louis Pasteur looked at a healthy fermentation, he saw these yeast cells that were round. When he looked into the sour fermentations, these yeast cells had started to elongate and become kind of oblong. And he was like, well, something is going on here. And now we can spot these off fermentations early, or these corrupted yeasts, because we know that the shape will change.
Yeah.
This was a big day for the Bigot family. That meant that they could chuck out yeast or fermentations that were going to go wrong. But according to Mr. Bigot's diary, he seems overly excited by this discovery, and specifically by some other things that he sees under the microscope. And these things turn out to be lactic acid producing bacteria that were turning these fermentations sour. So why was he very excited about this? Well, in Louis Pasteur's diaries, he writes that he thought that this could be related to the mystery, as he puts it, of life and death. So we'll get to that mystic bit of prophecy in a second. So I said that Pasteur is credited with discovering the role of fermentation, the idea that it is yeast eating up sugar and kicking out CO2, alcohol, flavours. So he read, obviously, the work of Theodor Schwann and several other people that were involved in that, and he basically designed the experiment that started to prove it to the very sceptical establishment. So he took that flask idea, but he took it a step further, and what he did was he got these flasks that had these swan necks.
Yep.
Within the swan neck, he actually put asbestos in there, so a mineral wool that he would allow to get exposed to the air,
and it would trap what he thought were the microbes, the yeast, all this kind of stuff that could ferment the liquid inside. And he'd seal these, put them into a warm area, and hopefully, once he tipped it, got the asbestos into the liquid, it would start fermenting. And the thing that he did that was really interesting is he took these flasks that he produced all over France. Like he had them, put them, up mountains by glaciers. He put them in the observatory of Paris. Exactly. Right. And he proved, without exception, in every single location, at least one of the flasks started to ferment. Wow. When really they had no right to.
Wow.
But basically, he then gets distracted by the fact that everybody else who produces alcohol starts knocking on his door going, we get sour fermentations too, what's going on? And so it's Napoleon commissions him to look into the affliction of sour wine.
Wow.
Obviously, he's a French man, he's in France, and one of the biggest exports for France was, of course, wine. So it was a big issue if the wines weren't of the quality that they need to be or if they had to be scrapped. So he goes to the Jura region of winemaking in France, and he does this incredible study, Études Sylvain, where he studies winemaking holistically. And he looks at everything, even like light on barrels and stuff, and how this affects the fermentations. And he comes up with several recommendations to the wine industry to prevent sour fermentations. Obviously looking at under a microscope, looking at the yeast cells. But also he recommends, once it's bottled, heating these bottles to around about just under 70 degrees. A process which within a couple of years would come to be known as Pasteurization. So he creates that for wine. We'll give wine that. But he also gets commissioned to look at beer. He's a very patriotic man. He looks at Germany and the UK, the big brewing powerhouses of the time, and goes, why can't France be like that? So he goes to a French brewery and tries to do the same that he did for wine. But unfortunately, the French brewers, it seems they didn't really understand what they were doing, what was happening, and they didn't have the data that he needed. So he went to the UK. And he visited Whitbread, among other breweries. And he took his microscope and he went to Whitbread. They welcomed him with open arms, like, come have a look. I'd imagine to show off, being like, our fermentations rarely go sour. And he looks at this pitch and goes, that yeast is infected. Oh. Have you had any complaints? And they go, well, actually, yeah, we just had to get a brand new batch of yeast. So they're like, okay, so this guy knows what he's talking about. He goes off to some other breweries, comes back a week later to Whitbread, and they bought themselves a microscope. So he then makes similar recommendations to the brewing industry. Not only the idea of pasteurization, the idea of thoroughly cleaning your brewery, which according to spontaneous generation would have been a bad thing. You might want things around to generate whatever it is that was going to ferment beer. Exactly. But another thing that he suggests is what's called an acid wash. So he'd suggest using an acid to clean your yeast pitches, to clean your brewery, because he'd realised that strong acids were killing the bacteria under the microscope, but not killing yeast. Yeast was hardy enough that it would survive an acid wash. So he was suggesting this to breweries and to winemakers and to distilleries, and having great effect, like far fewer wild inoculations and off beers, off wines, off spirits. So this acid wash was a revelation in brewing and winemaking, but it was also one of the most important discoveries in the history of humanity in an entirely different field, which is medicine. So this is, I think, one of the great discoveries I've made for this book, and not a link that I'm aware of has been made often before. And I found this while looking through, it's actually Louis Pasteur's son-in-law wrote a biography of Louis Pasteur after he died. Very early 20th century it was written. And within this is a letter that's sent to Louis Pasteur in the mid-1870s by a man called Joseph Lister. And Joseph Lister was a surgeon in Scotland. His dad was a wine importer, which might explain why he took Louis Pasteur's science very seriously and got hold of it as well. And he specifically was reading Louis Pasteur's studies around beer and was learning a lot from this. And he made this connection to go, if we can clean yeasts with acid and kill the bacteria, what if we cleaned the wounds of people with injuries with this? Would this stop the kinds of infections that you've been getting in beer or in lots of other things? Yeah. And this was a really important thought for a surgeon, because we just invented anesthesia. So we were getting pretty gung-ho, like quite literally digging deeper into humans than ever before. And as a result, lots and lots of people were dying, not of the original affliction, but of infection shortly afterwards. So he thought, right, why don't we try washing people's wounds with acid. And what he does with the first one, he picks a very specific injury, which is the compound fracture. So where bone breaks and goes through the skin, because that was essentially a death sentence. There's so much surface area to get infected. It's such a deep wound, and it's very hard to reset. And actually, mostly the treatment was amputation, because that was safer, because you could control the actual break there. So he tries out this brand new theory of he washes the wound with acid. He then covers it in acid-washed bandages, and then he covers that in acid-washed metal to seal it off from the outside world. And the first time he does this, unfortunately, the patient gets infected and still dies. The second time he does it with a stronger acid on a child, and the child is walking 6 weeks later, no infection.
Wow.
Now, obviously, people had survived compound fractures before, so that didn't prove too much. So he then finds a man who has had a compound fracture in both his legs after a pipe mould fell on him. And he's going to be laid up for so long, but also he starts to get bed sores from being laid up for so long.
Yeah.
So he goes and he does the same procedure with the stronger acid, both breaks, and then treats the bed sores with the acid as well. And this man who had absolutely no right to survive, survives. And after this happens, he starts recommending to other surgeons that they wash wounds, that they wash their hands, that they wash the surgeries, even the air of the surgeries that they're working in, with acid to avoid these infections happening. And he sends a letter to Louis Pasteur inviting him to his surgery, saying, please come here and see what me applying your science has done to the medical world. And he says that you have done a great service to humanity here. And slowly but surely, other surgeons start to adopt this. Initially, people are very skeptical, but then we have to give full credit to Joseph Lister for sticking by it, and it's why there's lots of hospitals named after Lister now. It's genuinely, you know, he's not quite invention of penicillin, but it is one of the most important discoveries in modern medicine that allowed us to treat and to operate without the risk, severe risk, of infection. And all that comes from a study into why beers turn sour.